In 2011, I was doing youth ministry in Michigan, and one of my jobs was every other year to take high school students on a pilgrimage. And we had a group that was remarkably dedicated in their own way to preparing for this pilgrimage that year. And they had chosen a theme, a great theme of whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all to the glory of God. And we had a great agenda planned out for how we were going to look at some of the theory of how you could do that and some of the history of how you could do that, because we were going to New England and there was a lot of history of how people had tried to do everything to the glory of God, and how people were doing it today, and it was really well set up, and yet we kept hitting all these roadblocks. We had one point in the year where there was somebody who was maybe going, and then maybe not going, and then maybe going, and then maybe not going, and normally we would have said, like, yo, fish or cut bait. But in this particular instance, it made sense that they didn't know, and then there was somebody else who had a similar situation because of a school thing that they couldn't control that came up later, and so we figured out who was going, and then about, I think it was 2 days before the trip, our male adult called me and said, so you know that my wife's mother has been in failing health for like the last 3 years, but it looks like her health might finish failing in the next 3 weeks, and I don't know what to do. And finally he went with us, but then he had to leave 2 days in, and it was just that kind of trip. Maybe you've had a trip like that, or an experience like that. And sometimes in those times, it feels like, okay, this is super frustrating, but it doesn't feel like there's any great purpose to it, right? But sometimes it really feels like, and I had a sense as we prepared for that trip, as everything kept getting interrupted, there is something bigger, there is something that God is up to in this trip. And there is something bigger out there, not than God, but bigger than me, that doesn't want that to happen. There is something good enough here. If we can pull this off, this is going to be amazing, not only that we pulled it off, but because there is something in here that is worth opposing. There's a lot we don't know about evil. How it works, where exactly it comes from. Literal gallons of ink have been spilled by theologians and thinkers trying to pin down what evil is and where it comes from. And really the best we have is how people have noticed and experienced evil in our great stories and in people's lives, and how that's been worked out. We don't have concrete answers. We don't have a study that says, ooh, hey, we tested evil's DNA and here's what we know about it now. Some people experience evil in personified forms as demons and devils. Many do not. What we do know, what we cannot deny, is that evil is. That evil exists in our world. That is hard to deny just when we look at the world. And it's hard to deny also that evil has a tendency to show up in reaction as backlash, in reaction to what is good. Falling in love often makes people freak out. Community that sees the truth of us often makes people run away. Stepping up and making a public commitment to justice often draws out trolls and worse. Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes says that there is nothing the forces of evil are drawn to more than light, and there is nothing more light than new life. And so when we are most alive and most aligned with the divine light, then we are also most visible and attractive to the more shadow side forces around us. Thankfully, most of the time, that does not involve literal devils talking to us as we have in today's gospel story. Most of the time, it's more like C.S. Lewis Screwtape Letters, where the fictional older demon coaches the younger one to twist his object's thoughts, to convince him of his own value and or his own wickedness, to get him to focus on himself, act outside of his community, to convince him that he has to look out only for himself because nobody else will. Most of the time, it means that when we begin to do a big, brave thing, we will be gripped by doubt and fear inside and challenged from the outside. And often we will not remember how normal this is. We will usually not remember that this happened even to Jesus. Oh, so there is. Thank you. All right, I will try not to step on that stink bug. We'll let it be off of me. I have no idea whether that happened to Jesus. But he talked outside a lot, so let's assume it did. But starting this story where we get it today is a little bit like starting Star Wars with Luke and Leia and Han in the trash compactor. Most of the epic journey is still ahead. You can catch up on the story. You can figure out what's going on. But if you don't know what has happened and who these people are and what they're doing in the trash, then it's going to take some catching up and you're going to miss some of what is going on. You have no idea why it matters that they are in the trash, or for that matter, why it matters whether they get out of the trash. If you don't know, and if you only know this story from Sunday church, from the lectionary, then all you have to tell you is the very first few words of the reading, and you might well not know that the previous chapter is about Jesus' baptism, and that right before then Jesus was led out is a voice came from heaven and said, "You are my son, my beloved, with you I am well pleased." If you don't know that that is the context, and again, there's very little reason, sorry, I was checking to make sure I don't have a bug underfoot. There's very little reason why you would know. You might be inclined to think that this is a nice sort of Lenten origin story that shows us that it's possible to withstand temptation because God is pretty cool, which God is, and this is, but you might be, well, tempted to leave it there. And then you might not know that one of the great, amazing pieces of good news that the gospel of Jesus Christ has for us is that it both warns us that this will happen to us, and if we keep reading, we learn that even those tests are ones that we can overcome because it is not on our own power that we do so. And that actually the process of overcoming them is a lot more like a licensing process than it is like the ACT kind of test. Because in these tests comes the practice that Jesus needs, the practice that we need to keep choosing the good over and over again. It doesn't have to be perfected before we get tested. It's perfected in the testing. You might not know, if you don't know the whole story, that these things can happen to us, and you might not see how crafty the evil one can be, from Genesis time in the very beginning to Jesus' time to ours, to couch these temptations in terms of half-truth. Not alternative facts that we can see clearly are obviously ludicrous, but things that are so nearly true that we have to be careful to look at the whole thing to notice that they are subtle traps. From the beginning, where the snake says, "If you eat this, you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And Adam and Eve eat, and they do know good from evil, but they are not quite like God. The snake doesn't warn them that just because we usually can tell the difference between right and wrong doesn't mean that we are always able to make it all the way to the good, to choose the right. "If you worship me, I will give you command of all the whole world," the devil says to Jesus, "and you will be able to rule it justly and righteously in the way it should be ruled even. But you will have forfeited your soul." These are the stories we retell because these are the tests that we routinely fail. Because there is a partial truth to our need to be fed, to pursue learning, to be safe, to not be afraid to claim the power that we do have and use it for good. And if the evil one can force us into a choice between humility and confidence, between being nourished and being generous, between being loved and loving, between believing that we are dust and believing that we are powerful, there is in that already a victory for the forces of the shadows. Because in granting the premise, we will have taken a step away from the full truth. That true confidence is not opposed to true humility, because neither is ultimately about us. That nourishment is about knowing how to say enough, and generosity is trusting that enough is enough to share. That we love because we first were loved. That we are powerful dust because our power is not our power, but is the power of God. And so we are responsible for its right use, but also empowered for whatever it is that God has actually asked of us. This is something that I think has shown up in the life of Good Sam's over and over. There is something very powerful at work in what Good Sam's is up to. This project of an inclusive and outward-facing church for all people based on love is powerful. And it is threatening to the powers that don't want to see the dignity of every human being respected and honored, that don't want to see a just and peaceful world built. Good Sam's has done a good job of rolling with the punches that come with creating something that shakes up the status quo. I loved what Mr. Inge said about shaking up the equilibrium, that equilibrium is death. Equilibrium has, I think, not been Good Sam's primary temptation, and certainly not Good Sam's primary experience. From the very beginning, this is a church that has sort of never not been in transition. And that should not surprise us in a way, because there is a sense in which transition or change are just names for growth. That my professor of spirituality and church history in seminary used to say something very similar, that things that are rigid are dead. Things that are growing are in flux. That doesn't mean that there is no hope ever for any sort of stability. If that were the case, I think we'd be built differently as humans. We would crave it less. But there is a sense in which we are built to manage change because change is the only constant. And it should not surprise us when we begin big things and we meet with resistance, when it gets hard, when it feels impossible even. We don't have to reach any sort of consensus about how the forces that stand opposed to love are at work in order to agree on that conclusion. All we have to do is to stand united in love, to remind one another what it is that we are working for and not just against, to remind one another that it is by God's power and not just on our own strength that we do this work of following Jesus with open minds and hearts to serve. Amen.